This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. So on the continued fallout of Trump's comments in the wake of the violence in Charlottesville on Saturday, yesterday he disbanded, or depending on whose story you believe, they were internally disbanded, his business panels, his advisory councils, manufacturing council, as CEOs were fleeing them. Holman Jenkins writing in the Wall Street Journal today, Trump loses corporate America. But my question is, can you lose something you never possessed? And that's sort of what Holman Jenkins is getting to.
Well, yeah, and all the CEOs, they felt like it was more of a photo op than they actually accomplished something. When they'd have these meetings.
They weren't trying to accomplish anything.
It was just, yeah.
There's nothing to accomplish in the advisory councils. What they want is to be there for administration successes and to push their particular interests, like tax reform, for example. As Holman Jenkins writes, these are some of America's most delicate PR canaries, surrounded by risk-averse advisors. Yeah, you don't see a lot of courage from corporate boardrooms as a matter of course. Mr. Trump's administration turning out not to be the administration they were hoping for, they're probably the one they realistically expected. Especially, he has not made headway on corporate taxes, the issue that brought him whatever benefit of the doubt America's CEO class was willing to give him. Remember, most of these people are center-left.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, so for all the railing against corporate America and CEOs, they're essentially financiers and fellow travelers of the center left.
Yeah, but and the left-wing media is saying that it's a very public rejection of Donald Trump.
Yeah, which of course is silly, but of course that's the D.C. press corps.
But the CEO of Campbell Soup, they were, social media was having a field day because whatever CEO didn't resign from these specific councils, whether it's a manufacturing or strategy and policy forum, they were being trolled on Twitter. There was a Campbell Soup sign, and then they put white nationalists underneath.
Yeah,
so
boo-hoo.
Everyone resigned.
Yeah, right.
Shut her down
because that's the
they don't want to lose business.
Yeah, that's the level of courage. That's the point. So if you're looking for courage or moral clarity from C-suites in this country, Fortune 500 C-suites, you're looking in the wrong place. And Holman Jenkins, who's no necessary fan of Trump, says exactly that. None of the departing CEOs likely believe Trump is a white supremacist or a Nazi sympathizer. They just see no upside to being associated with him. He points out the Under Armour CEO, Kevin Plank, perhaps indulged a greater honesty when he suggested his company belatedly remembered that it engages in innovation and sports, not politics. Oh, right. Mm-hmm. So the CEO's leaving. What does that portend with respect to Trump's ability to build the coalition he needs to advance economic policies, some of which I think could produce real economic opportunity? Well, for help in answering that question, we're pleased to be joined by Bob Woodson. This is one of the great things about this show, as I often say, is you get to talk to people whose work you've admired for a long time, but you probably wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to discuss with that individual. And Bob Woodson is one of those people whose work I've admired for a long time. His writings, he's been an intellectual mentor to people like Paul Ryan with respect to entitlement reform, welfare state reform. He is the founder and president of the Woodson Center. It used to be called the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, for those who know of Bob Woodson's works, and it was appropriately renamed to honor his life's work. And with that, we're pleased to be joined by Bob Woodson. Mr. Woodson, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
I'm pleased to be here again.
Thank you. So why don't we start with your reaction as an entrepreneurial sort yourself to the business reaction to Trump?
I mean, I think they were probably looking for any excuse to bail out anyway, but they're not known for courage, as you said. But I just think that I'm not so sure what they were doing anyway.
Well, Well, when it comes to Trump and the economic policies, perhaps entitlement reform policies you'd like to see him pursue, how do you bump those up against the week that he's had in terms of whether or not he's making progress towards seeing those things come to fruition or he's regressing?
Well, I think that all of this attention, I think what you have here is a self-inflicted wound. I just think he should have stayed with his original statement and just repeat it and then go off. And what he has done is just created an opening for his enemies to attack him, so they don't have to. But because it was important that the center left in America is just using race as a bludgeon against anyone who would oppose them, and they are using race to just completely dismantle or attack anyone who has a contrary point of view. I'm a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement, and I can tell you that removing of those statues is the worst thing that we can do. It's trying to revise history, and the very fact that the Holocaust Museum is there for us to remember, and so we won't forget. And I think that those statues and all are part of our history. And I think, but the left is using them to attack not just Donald Trump, but also the foundation of principles and values of our founders. The agenda is much larger than even race. They're trying to just, I think, create kind of degeneration within this culture. And that's why what the Woodson Center is doing is going to push back against that. We formed a coalition of people, some center right, some center left, but primarily people who want to stop those that have hijacked the civil rights movement. It's been hijacked and used as a means of promoting an anti-American agenda, and so we're going to confront that.
Were any of your members in Charlottesville over the weekend?
No, we were not in Charlottesville over the weekend because we tend to not get involved in demonstrations and whatnot. People are using symbols to substitute for substance, real solutions. These politicians are talking with great pride that they're going to take down Baltimore, for instance. They took down 2 monuments yesterday in a city that has the highest black-on-black crime murder rate in the country. They're also gentrifying low-income blacks out of those communities. So not only are they removing statues, they're removing poor people from these communities. But as long as we can focus on symbols, we won't have to confront substance.
As for those of you who don't know, you mentioned it, but I want to put an exclamation point after it. So you are a contemporary of Martin Luther King. You marched with, you work with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. At
the same time, yeah, I was leading demonstrations in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and I worked for the National Urban League for 5 years. So I'm a veteran of that civil. I went to jail in fight for that movement. But what the movement that I fought for and in is now dwarfed into a race grievance industry. It is nothing at all of what it was. Someone once said, sometimes great causes degenerate. It moves from a great cause, then it becomes a business, and then it degenerates into a racket.
Mm-hmm. And so is the watershed moment, or at least as it turns out, looking back, Great Society and the big welfare state programs, where did the civil rights movement veer off into the wilderness?
I think when they embraced the poverty programs of the 60s, I wrote about this. I said that we fought low-income blacks. I split with the civil rights movement because many of those who suffered and sacrificed, like low-income blacks, did not benefit from the change. I fought against forced busing for integration. I said the goal should be desegregation and not integration. If people want to voluntarily integrate, they should. But public policy should give everybody the freedom to assemble and associate with whoever they please. But we shouldn't force people to assemble. And now the civil rights movement, it was a movement for inclusion it was a movement to be included into the American society. And now it's being used to exclude people. You've got these various identity groups, gays, women's groups. There are separate graduation ceremonies identity graduation ceremonies on campus. This is not what the civil rights movement was all about.
Well,
It wasn't about, it wasn't about that. It was about fighting for equal opportunity, leveling the playing field. It wasn't but for it to be treated as some exception.
It seems to me, too, just speaking of K through 12 education, we're having this debate in Illinois right now. Of course, it's happened in other parts of the country. It's happened at the national level with Betsy DeVos's elevation to be education secretary about choice at the K through 12 level, resources that provide choice for those that don't have the resources and otherwise force-fed into the neighborhood school. We know what the results are from empowering people with those kind of choices. We know it's disproportionately minorities that don't have those choices, particularly in urban centers. And yet where you hear from national, quote-unquote, teachers union leaders like Randy Weingarten is that choice is racism. I mean, it seems so the people that are being frozen out are people that individuals like you fought to extend opportunity to for inclusion, as you say. Now trying to include them is racism.
Absolutely. We're working very closely with Beth Feely, who is working with parents in Illinois, where some of those suburban school districts are being forced to embrace cultural competency, and students are required to acknowledge their racism and without any competition. And so, and also we're talking about the dumbing down of curriculums, doing away with honors programs because it's unfair to minorities. I mean, this is kind of the denigration of society in the name of social justice is one of the most dangerous things that I have seen over the last 50 years.
Well, then what about
really destroying America from within?
Well, what's President Trump's role in all of this? I mean, his comments on Tuesday, did he empower what you call the race grievance industry?
Well, he really did. I just think he should have, again, stayed with his original statement. But the fact that he went off message and just, unfortunately, that was not the place to equate those who were counter demonstrators with the Klan and others. There have been for instance, out in Berkeley, you had the alt left burning buildings and whatnot. A man in Dallas who shot 5 police officers when President Obama sort of parsed his words. He said, yes, we were against the violence of this man, but nobody associated Black Lives Matter with this killer. The way they are associating the man who ran down these people with the demonstrators there. But they didn't make that same connection. Unfortunately, as it was reported, Obama's caucus supported him in this, and Trump's made that unfortunate comparison. That was not the context in which to do that. There have been circumstances where the left has been really violent, like in Evergreen and Olympia, Washington. These students were chasing down other students with baseball bats in the name of social justice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want,
but the press didn't cover that.
Yeah, I want to get your opinion about something as someone who lived through violence, racial violence, lived through de jure segregation, systemic racism imposed by the state. And now you see from Ferguson to Charlottesville, not it being imposed by the state per se, you see sort of de facto segregation being accepted. You mentioned the separate graduation ceremonies and so forth. Is that the left has figured out that culture is more important than the law, and the law follows culture. So if we can establish it culturally, we'll inculcate it legally. And where you see this country going, if we're going, if we're really regressing, Ferguson, Charlottesville, these are not going to be isolated incidents. We're going down a very dark road.
We really are, and I think you stated it perfectly. But we've got to have an answer. Conservatives do not have a ground game.
Mm-hmm.
I said that if conservatives were fighting the Second World War and an invasion of Normandy, we would have had an Air Force and a Navy, but we would not have had Marines and soldiers. We got to put ground troops. That's why we're organizing what we're calling a free speech civil rights coalition that will organize various groups around the country that are fed up with being marginalized, with being denigrated. There needs to be a landing place, and the Woodson Center is creating its coalition, it's a free speech civil rights coalition, so that we can begin to bring people together to push back against this denigration of this country. But we can't do it by just offering counter arguments. The Woodson Center has a cadre of low-income leaders in all over the country who are restoring.
What? Hold on. That was anticlimactic. Restoring is leaving us hanging. What? It's like you have to come back after the break to find out the conclusion to the Bob Woodson policy for resolving all the afflictions that we discussed. Anyway, he's Bob Woodson, founder and president of the Woodson Center. Somebody that you should check out. The Woodson Center you should check out. Get to know about his work if you don't already know about it, and because there's work going on, as he said, nationally. It's a national organization in scope as well as in terms of policy.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.